a member of the Order of Canada. She's written 7 books. And oh yes, she's also the leader of the Green Party and has a great deal to say about the workings of democracy, or not, or not, in this country. So I'd ask you to welcome Elizabeth May.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here, particularly on this discussion with John Ibbitson, because I very much enjoyed his book. As you can see, I'm just going to hold them up. You can see we're twins in this. This is not an accident. McClellan and Stewart, our shared publisher, decided to start with my book, kind of a series that would get people discussing democracy. They're thinking back to the sort of pamphleteering of Tom Paine and Common Sense. And so it's quite deliberate. I mean, the first time I saw John's book first, I thought, oh my gosh, there's my book again. That's not me, that's John Ibbitson. What the? But also, very bizarre, well, actually not, because we both speak nothing but the truth. So our books resonate and tell somewhat the same story, but from a different perspective. So John's very open and shut why America has Barack Obama and Canada has Stephen Harper. What could be more depressing? Perhaps only... And my title is Losing Confidence, Power, Politics, and the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. And not as depressing a title as John's, surprisingly enough. I have to say, first of all, that I am not personally losing confidence in Canadian democracy or in Canadian citizens, but I'm profoundly worried about a number of the same trends that John identified, and we come at it from different perspectives. Obviously, as he's just told you, being in Washington, D.C. as bureau chief for the Globe and Mail, watching the U.S. presidential process. I relate in my book how he came from the States, came back to Canada, and I suppose something like Rip Van Winkle, what happened to my country? Oh my gosh, things have gotten a bit worse. I don't want to put words in your mouth, John, but certainly the advent of Stephen Harper's style of government has been the most closed, top-down, dictatorial regime that we've ever had in Canada. But as John points out in his book, every time a Canadian columnist writes, this government is the most centralized, power is concentrated in the prime minister more than at any time in history, it's always true. Because starting with Pierre Trudeau, who I think the measures that Trudeau took to create the prime minister's office as an entity, it really wasn't. When Lester Pearson was prime minister, in the research I did, you go back and you find Tom Kent recalling that Lester Pearson had in the PMO sort of a handful of stenographers and somebody looking after things, and it was real cabinet government. And Tom Kent would say that the Lester Pearson government was the last true cabinet government Canada had. The wonderful anecdotes of John Turner when he was Minister of Justice under Trudeau, complaining to Tom Axworthy, who was then one of the junior staffers at PMO, running around to make sure, nipping at the heels of ministers to make sure they were doing the right sorts of things. And Turner called them the junior G-men, and he wanted to know what they were doing in his office. Well, that's nothing compared to then Mulroney created a much larger PMO, but that's nothing compared to Chrétien's PMO, which is nothing compared to Harper's PMO. So if you look at the trends of what's happening in Canadian democracy, although it's true, as John just said, that the most powerful political leader in the world is still arguably the President of the United States, it's also true, as Denise Savoy said, as a political scientist in Canada, when you study the relative powers of a British Prime Minister, a Canadian Prime Minister, and a US President, in our system in Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister has unrivaled powers compared to the two others within their own nations. And that's because, of course, in Canada, we didn't ever have a revolution. We don't have a division between legislative and executive. And a prime minister in this country who chooses to try to control everything, as Mr. Harper now does, doesn't have any checks and balances to control that, other than an obstreperous caucus, which Mr. Harper does not seem to have, or a really engaged media, which we no longer have. And I say that with trepidation, but the concentration of corporate media power in this country, combined with the recession and the financial woes of our news media, mean that it's vanishingly true that we never had a Woodward and Bernstein in Canada, for instance, but if we needed one ever, we need them now, and we simply don't have it. The news media has become much less engaged in in-depth whistleblower going after things. Now, in terms of the open and shut argument that John makes, I couldn't agree more. As an environmental lawyer, we always used to joke that if you wanted to try to get any information on what was going on in Canada, you were far better to look at access to information on the US side of the border. If you wanted to find out about pollution in Canada, you were better off to look to the EPA and the US Environmental Protection Agency to see what they had listed. And recently as Barack Obama's visit to Canada, and of course everyone in Canada knew you'd have to have very heightened security. The newly elected president of the United States was coming here. Obviously, there'd be real security concerns about the agenda. But if you wanted to find out what Stephen Harper and Barack Obama planned to do in Canada, you would have to ask the US news media, because they had a complete schedule, and the Canadian news media was given very little detail on anything. As I said, when I was practicing environmental law, we used to joke that Canadian laws constituted freedom from information. And